Again, this is another Japanese film,
Mm-hmm.
and um, culturally, I think are just much more independent.
Mm.
Um, in like young children are more independent than American children of the same age are
Mm-hmm.
over. So I think that plays into it too. It's like no, like a couple of children in modern America would never like the idea that they would just go live on their own
Mm.
is a little ridiculous,
Yeah.
but it kind of makes sense for World War II era Japan,
Mm-hmm.
at least from my knowledge of the culture there.
Yeah.
I mean, like, even recently,
Mm.
you have, and I only know this because they made like a Netflix documentary or like show about it. You had like little villages where like these little 5-year olds, little toddlers would be going like running basic errands for their parents, like
Mm.
going like walking to the store to buy something, stuff like that, you know? It's like we don't do that with kids in America, but in Japan it makes a little more sense, I think.
Mm. That's also generally more safer there, just in general. I mean, I know that's a general term, but it really is safer over there, legit. With the culture and the way it emphasizes that, the importance of children, all that kind of thing. If only we had that kind of thing here. That's the kind of thing I envy of Japan with over here, which I wish we had over here in America, is a much more, I don't know, culture focused on family and the importance of it. I know that in multiple places in this country there is. However, growing up in California, and growing up in a good family for sure, but just seeing so many, I think it's weird. Like, you could relate it as somebody analyzing the culture of, oh, well, they've given up on God. But then you look at that culture and you're like, well, yeah, but they didn't really have that. They had more Eastern influence. So they didn't have Jesus, for example. But they still propped up a culture of the importance of family.
Yeah.
However, God still needs to be a factor. Don't get me wrong. So,
Yeah, I mean, well, there's definitely all sorts of negative toxic aspects to
yeah.
Japanese culture as
Mm-hmm.
well. But one thing they have is a small homogenous population.
Mm.
You know, people don't really like to talk about that a lot nowadays because it's seen as it kind of goes against the sort of liberal values we all purport to uphold,
Mm.
the idea of when I say liberal, I'm not talking about like conservative versus liberal, but I'm talking
Mm.
about the idea
The
of
idea of,
of
yeah.
classical liberalism
Mm-hmm.
as the sort of foundational philosophy that underpins Western democracy in general.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't really like to talk about um, things like the homogeneity of the effect of a homogenous culture and population
Mm.
that it has on a place because, again, as living in a liberal society, we're, you know, taught to try and view everyone as fundamentally the same,
Mm.
kind of a thing because we don't want to be racist and all this and that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's one thing about Japan is it's just not an ethnically diverse place. And because it's
Mm.
not an ethnically diverse place, shared values take hold much more deeply
Huh.
than they do over here.
Mm.
And that's the thing, too. It's really hard to speak about
Yeah.
American versus Japanese culture, specifically because of the issue of homogeneity, because America is a huge country,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of population and in terms of the actual landmass. And so talking about American culture like as a whole is kind of a fruitless thing because American culture is not a monolith. There are like, where we are, we have a certain culture. It doesn't, again, we're more ethnically diverse than Japan would be, simply because of the history of this state, and its proximity to Mexico. So we have more.
Yeah, well, there's a huge melting pot for every
Yeah,
kind of thing in
we have
America.
more of a ethnic diversity over here, sure, for sure. But at least in our part of California, there does seem to be people hold to more shared values than I think I've seen from other parts of the nation. So it kind of varies from place to place.
It varies. Yeah. I mean,
whereas like in Japan, like
it's all one place.
Yeah.
And it's really dense too. I looked up the population just currently, and Japan's got roughly 123 million at this moment. And then America's got, by mid-2025, it's estimated to be 347. So more than double. And I don't think population has to do with every aspect of what we're talking about. And we can go on for days to talk about homogeneity in societies and the positives and negatives. And religion and ethnicity, and you can go a lot of different ways with that conversation, but I like how you brought it up because it's a conversation that nobody likes to talk about in America, or I guess in general, I don't really have had a conversation about that with anybody. Maybe that's a good reason, but it's the truth, I think, in a way. It's part of the truth, I would say, of the reason why they've held that for so long. But it's kind of the same aspect for me that we talked about in this corner of the world, like looking at another culture through that lens, in the sense of they lost, and they've really, we taught them a lesson as a country back in that day. And I'm not saying we as in the we of today, but the we back then did, when you were talking about that, I'm like, ooh, tread carefully, David. I don't want you to get canceled, bro. And what David was saying, he's not referring to like, oh, if it was only white people or if it was only black people or Mexican. No, it's the culture and the races. Like it's a huge expanding topic that we could talk about again for hours. But it's not about like this race or this race. It's the culture within it, and the strength of homogeneity with that, and ironing, cementing it in the culture, I would say. Is that what you were kind of getting at?
I mean, this is such a rabbit trail for this episode, but yeah, I am talking about race, by the way.
Yeah.
I am talking about race.
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about race in terms of like, I'm not talking about race in terms of like, oh, white people are genetically predisposed to this and Asians are genetically predisposed to that. And you
see it all over the world.
Like you could argue that in a really roundabout way, culture is downstream from race, but I'm not really talking about like immutable characteristics of a race or anything like that. I'm just talking about simple things like in
values.
homogeneous societies, shared cultural values take root much more deeply.
Yeah, that's just how it is.
Because we have something in us. It's called in-group bias, or it can be called out-group bias, depending on the context. And it's basically hardwired into the human psyche. We see someone who looks like us, we're more likely to be trusting of them. We see someone who doesn't look like us, we're less likely to be trusting of them. And that's different from racism.
Yeah.
That's completely different from racism. Racism is, I would call racism like um, outgroup bias gone wrong
Yeah.
is what I would call it. But I mean, obviously, it's a much more complicated subject than that. But suffice to say that this outgroup bias is hardwired into humans, and it informs how we see people, and how easily we form bonds with people. And so, as a result of that, ethnically homogenous societies have just formed tighter knit communities. Shared values take root in a much more deep form. And that's why, I mean, yeah, and that's why you see, America doesn't really have one singular culture, because people are all sort of fragmented in these little groups scattered across this huge nation that we live in. So it's just, there's no way for Americans to come to a place of deeply held cultural values in the same way that like Japan does.
This is a very fascinating topic, and I think that overall you could go with it any other way, but it makes me really quickly, it makes me think of the forces outside or even within the US. I think we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but when you analyze America from that way of how it can go any other way, and they're very much for freedom, right? And it's so, people are so outspread culturally, ethnically, all the sense, that to really make them fight within each other makes it really easy because of race or whatever, what have you. And those are the kind of tactics that have been used to bring this country down and to really take over this country from the inside for the last 80 years. And it's happened during the Cold War with Russia, communist China, North Korea, what have you. It's been a tale as old as time. And unfortunately, our education system doesn't want to educate Americans about that for whatever reason. You could go crazy into the hole and blame it on the Rothschilds or what have you, you know? But it's important to remember where you stand and where your foundation lies. And when you don't have God as the uniting factor, what do you have? You have family. You have relationships with those that look similar to you or what have you. Humans are humans. I mean, go and read the Bible and you see all the same kind of areas, you know? So it's funny also to see it in modern America that people seem to have a unified thing that they're hopeful for now. And people can relate it to nationalism. And I think that's also a factor with Japan as well. And Japan's no innocent creature at all. I mean, there's a reason we went to war with them, you know, in that era.
Yeah.
You know, as well as modern day, their birth rates are diving, but most of everybody's birth rates around the world are as well. So we could continue this topic, but let's move on. The last thing I have about this is